Good afternoon. I'm Scott Brockman, Vice President of Development at the Society of the University of Haifa. We are very appreciative that you've joined us for today's program, Israel and World Jewry in a Time of Crisis. The first of a three-part series in partnership with the acclaimed national law firm, Saul Ewing. It is an honor for me to introduce today's illustrious guest speaker, a Jewish advocacy veteran, and a man who the late Shimon Peres once called the foreign minister of the Jewish people, Mr. David Harris. For more than 40 years, David has assumed a front row seat when it comes to Jewish and pro-Israel advocacy as the chief executive officer of the American Jewish Committee, a position he held from 1990 to 2022. He was honored more than 20 times by foreign governments for his international diplomacy work, making him arguably the most decorated Jewish organizational leader in U.S. history. Under David's tenure, AJC established strong relations with governments in Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa, and even explored relations with the Arab world years before the Abraham Accords. Currently, David is the anchor of Defending Israel, a show on JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, for which he serves as a strategic analyst. Also joining us and moderating our program today is Jeff Robbins, ASUH Board Member and partner at Saul Ewing. We are thrilled to have him with us as well. Today's webinar sees Jeff explore a range of topical issues, including the October 7th aftermath and President Biden's handling of the Iron Swords War, growing tensions in Eastern Europe, and standing with Israel on the world stage. Before I hand you over to Jeff, I want to take this opportunity to welcome back supporters of ASUH and University of Haifa. With the universities opening its doors and resuming studies just over 2 months ago, following a delayed start of the academic year due to the ongoing war with Hamas and Gaza, it has served as a catalyst for healing between Israel's different ethnic communities. As Israel's most diverse campus, with 40% of the student body consisting of Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Bedouins, for 50 years, the university has played, and it will continue playing a central role in ensuring that all sectors of the Israeli population unite to nurture their beautifully diverse civic society. This role has proven more than ever today, with the university establishing a paradigm for healing throughout Israeli society. To support ASUH, the University of Haifa, in this mission, please visit asuh.org, donate. Tonight, we will ensure the University of Haifa continues its inspired efforts to heal Israeli society from its darkest hour. We also want to thank every one of you that has supported our scholarship fund for reserve soldiers during this extremely challenging time. Over the past 4 months, we've had 1,500 students and 50 faculty members serving in the reserves, including 300 students in the security forces, and have been able to provide emergency scholarships of around $500 for every one of these student soldiers. With your help, we can continue to increase this fund and ensure that our brave student soldiers who have been serving and defending our country have the financial assistance and their families that their families desperately need as they attempt to return to some degree of normal life. Again, to contribute in this timely and meaningful fund, please go to asuh.org/donate. And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome David Harris and Jeff Robbins to all of our listeners and watchers today on Facebook and here on Zoom. We will have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of this webinar, so please do leave any questions you have for David in the Q&A box if you are joining us on Zoom, or in the comments section if you are watching us now live on Facebook. Back to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you so much, David, for being here. And since we have in David one of the world's foremost public statesmen over the last 30 years, let me jump into delicate territory without delay. It's fair to say that President Biden cares deeply and viscerally about the state of Israel, and that he demonstrated it in numerous ways since October 7th, beginning with his visit to Israel, and in so many ways since then, including by being steadfast in his support, despite some pressure, mounting pressure from some on the left. But it's also fair to say, I think, that over the last several weeks, there have been signs that he and his team are working overtime to mollify or placate the left, including by using words like indiscriminate to talk about Israel's operations in Gaza, or over the top. and by a strategy of blaming people for blaming the Israeli government, it seems, it has sometimes seemed, for the continuation of the war. Is it a legitimate criticism of President Biden that by giving the impression that he is blaming Israel for a war that's not of its making, and by appearing to blame Israel for the fact that the war is ongoing 5 months in, he is, however, inadvertently fortifying and emboldening Hamas to reject ceasefires as it has done, and by ensuring the continuation of the war?
First of all, Jeff, allow me to thank the University of Haifa. I've been a fan for many years, and the American Society, and to all of you who are supporting this great university. And Jeff, I've known you for quite some time and admired your writing and your speaking. So it's a special privilege for me to be in conversation with you. I thought our friendship might have allowed for a easier softball opening question, but it's an important question, obviously, and not an easy one to answer. Number one, I completely agree with you that President Biden, starting on October the 7th, was really quite remarkable in his response. And I think his words and his actions came not just from the head, but came from the gut, from the kishkas. It was quite obvious. I remember that early speech he gave, which he may have read from a teleprompter, but it really came from his soul, and you could feel it. The trip. I mean, if one thinks about it, Franklin Roosevelt never, not once, traveled to London during the Second World War to stand with Winston Churchill and to show his support, although he did travel elsewhere. Joe Biden went, and he went early. And it was, again, a very, very touching visit. So I could spend much of this time, Jeff, just focusing on what he's done right, and what we all need to be thankful for. But it's true in recent weeks that he's showing mixed signals. And it occurred to me that, Margaret Thatcher once said to George H.W. Bush around the time of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, "George, don't go wobbly on me," or words to that effect. And my sort of cri de coeur is, President Biden, don't go wobbly on us. Israel seems to be the only country in the world that's not allowed to finish a war. And this war needs to be finished. And it needs to be finished not just for Israeli domestic political reasons, but it needs to be finished because Hamas threatens the West. And Hamas doesn't stand alone. Hamas is part of something larger, and it all leads back to Iran. And unless Iran and its proxies get the clear message of Israeli deterrence and determination and Western sustained support, then I worry that the war might come to a more ambiguous outcome. And a more ambiguous outcome will do two things, Jeff. Number one, it will ensure another October 7th down the road. And number two, a message that Iran in particular, receives, that you can outsmart, outmaneuver, outplay, and outweigh the West. We can't allow that to happen.
And as you indicate, it can be readily appreciated, the dilemma that the president finds himself in and his team, and the need to find some way to straddle the various considerations in question. The media, largely, and even on the soft left, appears to have adopted the idea that it is the right-wing Israeli extremist government, so-called, that's the formulation, that's responsible for the continuation of this war. An idea which, whatever many of us may think about the prime minister and about what has occurred, many of us find intellectually indefensible. It doesn't seem as though it is the Netanyahu government that's responsible for the continuation of the war. And it seems obvious, for example, over the last week when there's been a ceasefire deal on the table, as the National Security Advisor said yesterday, and it's been rejected. As somebody who has spoken regularly with presidents and with leaders of countries, Is there advice that you would give to the president as a genuine friend of Israel to modulate his messaging a bit to make it clear that he rejects that line rather than seem to accede to it in some way?
I think, firstly, what you said needs to be underscored. We should not be beating our chests and sort of activating the Jewish apology gene with which many of us seem to be gifted. This war would have occurred irrespective of who was the prime minister of Israel. And I think, Jeff, it's extremely important for all of us, and I speak as a nonpartisan, I have all my life, but for all of us to emerge from whatever sort of self-defined political camp we live in, and understand the reality as it is, and not as we would wish it to be through the lens of our left-wing, right-wing, progressive, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democratic lens. I think this goes way beyond that. It calls for something completely different after October 7th. And I'll put it very bluntly, we are at war. And when I say we are at war, I don't just mean that Israel's at war, though obviously it is at war. But in my view, there are three war fronts since October the 7th. Number one, obviously the military front. Israel was caught by surprise. That whole story will need a thorough investigation. I have no doubt that it will take place at the appropriate time in Israel, as it did after 1973 and the Yom Kippur War, after 1982 and the Lebanon War. I have full confidence in Israel's ability to investigate itself and draw even harsh conclusions. Number two is the home front in Israel. The resilience of the home front is absolutely essential, yet Hamas and its kindred spirits are doing everything possible to undermine and destroy the confidence, the resilience, the determination of the home front. Remember, October 7th was an assault on the kibbutz, on a music festival. I don't have to go down the list, we all know it. But there's a third front in this war, Jeff, and we have to wake up and recognize it. And the third front is the United States. Even long before October 7th, I believe that the long-term goal of our adversaries was to drive a wedge between Washington and Jerusalem. I spent decades, as you said, trying to help diversify Israeli foreign policy with some success. But, and it's a big but, there is no substitute for the role of the United States in the life of Israel. We know it, and our adversaries know it. And their goal, which they understand cannot be achieved overnight, but over time, is to try and create a gap. And if that gap should take place, Jeff, then all bets are off. All bets are off at the United Nations Security Council. You were involved years ago with the UN. You know, UN Security Council is the one UN body that has legally enforceable powers should it choose to exercise them. We know that that the US and the US alone is in a position to provide real-time intelligence, advanced weaponry, diplomatic support, go down the list in a way that no other country on earth is. And that third front cannot be manned, if you'll forgive the expression, by the IDF or the Mossad or the Shin Bet or the border police or by the Israeli home front. That's us. And what we're seeing is an assault on the home front. And it's happening particularly, as you mentioned, from the left. I don't want to define the left. I'll leave it sort of vague. But we begin to see within the Democratic Party in particular, erosion of support, a challenge to President Biden himself. And the question becomes, back to your first question, the extent to which he can resist it, and the extent to which he yields to it, and the extent to which he deems it important to the 2024 election, which is now becoming another consideration in this whole equation. So my whole goal since October 7th, Jeff, and I'm just one person, has not been so much to analyze the issues on the ground. I'll leave that to others. I want to mobilize. I want to mobilize this sleeping giant of American Jewry, some 7 million people, to wake up, to put aside whatever their predetermined ideological or political views were, and to understand this is a war that's been thrust on Israel and the Jewish people. And if we don't assume our place on the front lines, in this case in the United States, then I believe the risks are very great. And I've tried to explain exactly what those risks could be.
And I want to ask you about this battlefield, this third battlefield, the battlefield of American public opinion, which is the determining factor, as you say, in so many respects. We have all seen the sort of the shocking silence or contextualization or running for cover or even defense of what occurred on October 7th, and the criticism of Israel's seeming absolute need categorically to respond in a way which removes Hamas. The problems with support for Israel on the left of center are well known. They seem to be amplified by the media, perhaps gleefully, maybe not every week or so. As somebody who has been as keen an analyst and a strategist and an activist on the issue of trying to reinforce support for Israel in America where it belongs, what do you say, or what would you say, even privately, to leaders of the American Jewish community about how to mobilize in a way which addresses this new reality?
So I think, first of all, that we need to assess the role that existing Jewish organizations have played since October the 7th, especially in the advocacy space. I'm not now talking about the Society for the University of Haifa or Friends of Hadassah Hospital, but in the advocacy space, because the battlefield has changed dramatically, Jeff. And the question is, have advocacy organizations in the Jewish space understood the changes, been able to adapt to them, and show not just output, which organizations are usually quite adept at demonstrating, but frankly, outcomes, because the true measurement of the value of an institution are the outcomes. What's different because of their efforts? And I think in some respects, there's a lot of work still to be done. And there's some questions, Jeff, at least in my own mind, and I never thought I'd be saying this. Do we need yet another advocacy organization? One that is not bogged down in October 6th mindset, and that has to go through a massive internal exercise with staff, with donors, with lay leaders, in order to try and reshape itself, retool itself to the October 7th environment. And by the way, this goes as much for pro-Israel advocacy as it does for grappling with anti-Semitism. And perhaps one of your questions will address that, but let me get ahead of you, if I may. On the subject of anti-Semitism, for all the success that we thought we had as a community, and there was a lot of success to show for it, obviously, especially after the Second World War, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the normalization of American Jewish life, the mainstreaming of American Jews into every sector. The Joe Liebermans, who ran as vice president while being Shomer Shabbat and coming within a hair's breadth of becoming the vice president of the United States in 2001. So many examples. And yet, the strategies, Jeff, that have been employed don't seem particularly useful today. Holocaust education. We're all for it, obviously, but it doesn't seem to have done the trick. Interethnic diplomacy. Again, so many were involved, myself included, but where are those interethnic partners after October the 7th? Liberal democracy, as we've defined it. We're all in the same boat. We're all in this together. We were in the trenches together in World War II, and since then, even more so. None of those strategies seems to have worked, as we've seen this kind of surge on American campuses and on the streets. So what are the new strategies? And simply telling people that if they have the Salk or Sabin vaccine and their children don't have polio and they should be thankful to Jews, or telling people that if they enjoy the cherry tomato in their salad, they should be thankful to Israel for creating it, is not working, Jeff. Certainly not in the October 7th environment. And I think, again, I'll provoke. I think we need to roll up our sleeves. I think, number one, we have to stop being apologetic Jews. And too often we have apologetic Jews who have to start every conversation by saying, well, I don't like Benjamin Netanyahu either. I'm in favor of a two-state solution, so I'm one of the good guys. We have to stop being apologetic, number one. Number two, we have to start using lawfare much more. We have to start telling universities and others, we're no longer going to fall for your soft, gentle words. If you allow atmospheres which threaten and intimidate Jews, we're going to go after you. Again, unapologetically. And number three, Jeff, I think we all need to become even more Jewish, if I may say so. And I define that very broadly, very pluralistically, but more Jewish, all of us, and not go hide, not remove our mezuzahs, not hide our Stars of David, join congregations, travel to Israel, find the organizations that fit best, speak up, stand up. This is the moment, Jeff. Again, we are at war. I hate to say it, believe me. There's no joy in saying it, but there's even less joy in failing to understand the moment and pretending that it's anything else.
Let me follow up on something you said and ask something which is a particularly delicate question, and one which I take no joy in asking. But you have been somebody who has been, well ahead of, I think, everybody in terms of forging relationships between Jews and Israel and different communities in America, all over the world. And you've been extremely cognizant that this day or days like this could come, and have devoted your career to dealing with it. So I ask you sort of appropriately, one of the jolting and profoundly dispiriting aspects of the aftermath of October 7th, as you have said, is the extent to which groups with which Jews have been allied, of which Jews have been supportive, to which Jews have devoted their lives or portions of their lives, to which Jews have been loyal friends, have been silent or worse about the mini Holocaust that occurred. How should Jews react to that? It's a question that's being asked with some trepidation, but it's a question that's asked nonetheless. Should they resume alliances as usual? Should they say in substance that there should be some kind of reassessment, to use the diplomatic formulation? Should they say, look, we're done with these alliances, because on the grounds that if you could not stand up for us when October 7th happens, then I don't know how we stand with you. Some blend of that. What do you, with all of your wisdom and thoughtfulness and disinclination to act precipitously, what do you say to people who ask you variants of that question?
It's an important question, obviously, and an unavoidable question. My own answer is that I've lost friends since October the 7th. I've lost some family members over disputes, over differences, Jeff. And I'm sure there are many on this call who have been in the same experience. I can't pretend that October 7th didn't happen, or that they were silent or worse, and that it's just a passing moment and everything will sort of resume down the road. And I apply the same logic to organizations, to traditional partners. I think this requires a wholesale assessment and reassessment, Jeff. And it's not going to be easy. And I come back again to Jewish advocacy organizations. Are they going to have the courage and the spine to do this? Those organizations have devoted countless time, effort, resources to building those relationships. And yet, in our darkest moments since the Holocaust, they were silent, or perhaps they were even complicit in the opposition that emerged on campuses, on the streets, and social media. Can we just ignore that, minimize it, trivialize it? I don't think so. So I think there are going to be some tough conversations down the road, Jeff, but there's something else that needs to be said. And again, I stress, and my whole life reinforces it, Jeff, I'm a nonpartisan. I'm not here to advance the interests of the Republican or the Democratic Party. I lived my life to advance the interests of the Jewish people as best as I could. And when that aligned with Republicans, I was proud to speak up. And when it aligned with Democrats, I was proud. I was even more proud when it was bipartisan. But for example, those who said because it was Donald Trump that moved the embassy to Jerusalem, I'm going to sit quietly or even condemn it, I was not among them. To the contrary. I'm saying this, Jeff, because I think we have to reassess our relationships with those that traditionally many Jewish organizations have not wanted to engage with. More actively with the Republican Party. And again, I'm saying this as a Jew, not as a partisan, but to simply reject a big chunk of America, evangelical Christians, because there's much that we disagree with. I can tell you, Jeff, since I'm closer to the end of my life than the beginning, I have never once paid a political price for accepting the support for Israel from either Republicans or evangelical Christians or others. I've said thank you. I haven't questioned it. We've continued to disagree where we disagree, whether it's on theological or eschatological issues or other political questions. I don't see this as a sort of sum total where unless someone agrees with us 100% on everything from abortion to zoology, we're not going to engage with them. That was never the approach that I took in my life, very much the contrary. We need friends, we need allies. And by the way, Jeff, for anyone involved in politics, this is how smart politicians work. They're always looking for allies on a given issue, knowing that the next day there may be differences or strong disagreements on other issues. But you don't reject when you're trying to cobble together a majority of 51 in the Senate or reaching the magical number of 60. You don't reject out of hand the support of those you may disagree with even fiercely on other issues. I take the same approach on Israel, especially now when Israel's at war and when the single most important thing for us, Jeff, is to ensure that Israel has the time and the space to complete the operation as it deems appropriate. And sure, there's opposition. I get it. We've all seen it. But let's be clear what the opposition is supporting, Jeff, either explicitly or perhaps more subtly, but nonetheless supporting. They're supporting a terrorist organization listed by the Clinton administration years ago as a foreign terrorist organization. That's what they're supporting. They're supporting homophobia, misogyny, anti-Semitism. They're supporting bloodlust. Anyone who has seen the films that many were not supposed to see has to understand what we're up against here. We have Americans who are supporting Hamas, bloodlust, genocide, mutilation, misogyny, kidnapping. Jeff, if we're not going to stand up and fight back against that, then who are we? Who are we? What are we?
Let me ask you about campuses. You know, even the Harris poll, no relation, which provided the relatively good news that 82% of Americans support Israel and 18% support Hamas. Even if you buy that, that's 1 out of every 5 Americans who actually tell people they support Hamas in this conflict, which is jolting, to put it mildly. We have a young population that doesn't know the difference between the Gaza Strip and the Louisiana Purchase. And you've got campuses on which Jewish kids are petrified. It's no longer capable of being denied. Talk a bit about your thoughts about that. How do you try to, how do we all try to protect Jewish kids on campuses and try to get others to protect Jewish kids on campuses? And by protect, I don't mean just physically protect them, but unleash them to be advocates in support of Israel, which many of them would like to do.
I would begin by saying that we should not for a single moment make this a proprietary Jewish issue. I think that all Americans who care about these things should be deeply worried that on October the 8th, 34 organizations at what is widely considered America's most prestigious university, Harvard, joined together in order to blame Israel and Israel alone for the horrific events of October the 7th. Sure, Jeff, as a Jew, I was aghast. But I must say, as an American who cares about the university system, who's always viewed our universities in a way as sacred space, I have to ask the question, what went wrong? And then, of course, fast forward 2 months to December the 7th, and that now historically infamous congressional hearing with 3 university presidents, including the president of my alma mater, who I think displayed tragically just how far gone these universities are when it comes to Jewish matters. I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that had we been talking about an issue involving race or sexual orientation, the universities would have been quick and unambiguously clear in their denunciation, rather than hiding behind that so-called institutional neutrality. But we saw how the word context was given entirely new meaning, and we can spend time, Jeff. I'm not sure it's fruitful to ask whether the presidents are the reflection of the students or the students are the reflection of the administration. There's an interrelationship between the two, and I'm not sure it's worth spending a lot of time sort of breaking it down. But to me, that was a kind of 5-alarm bell for folks. Something has gone terribly wrong in our universities. A certain indoctrination, a certain ideology has replaced open inquiry, which had always been the hallmark of great universities. And instead, we now have superimposed on too many a kind of warped ideology, a bifurcated, a binary way of looking at the world between the oppressor and the oppressed, the powerful and the powerless, the white and the non-white, the occupier and the occupied, go down the list. And on each of those, in that mindset, Jeff, Israel comes out on the wrong side of the equation. So even though Israel is facing Hamas, a terrorist group, homophobic, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, bloodthirsty, the fact of the matter is that ideology still drives people to say, well, let's call it resistance. Let's give it the words that make us feel good about ourselves. Decolonization, resistance, end to occupation, supporting the powerless, the disenfranchised, the landless. So what kind of will make ourselves feel better by superimposing these feel-good terms, even though the recipient, the undeserved recipient of those terms, is a foreign terrorist organization linked to Iran that seeks the annihilation of the state of Israel, seeks to perpetrate another Holocaust, and opposes core Western values and core Western societies. That's where it's led, Jeff. And the question is now, after October 7th, after December 7th, after the spectacles we've seen from Harvard to Columbia and Cornell to MIT, is there going to be a wake up? And not just by Jews, but by everyone who cares about the integrity and the mission of our flagship universities.
So we have about almost 450 active participants in this webinar on this platform, which means that we have about 7,000 questions in the remaining 20 or so minutes. Let me ask you another delicate one about the debate now about a Palestinian state. On one hand, many people clearly believe that at the end of the day, that is the only quote unquote solution. And indeed, it's understandable why the administration, for a variety of reasons, both domestic and international, need to continue to say that there needs to be a two-state solution, and that is what ought to occur as soon as possible. And on the other hand, obviously, as many people on the call know, there is a history of that being offered and rejected. And moreover, you have October 7th being carried out by an entity that specifically rejected and rejects that. Finally, you have this overlay problem now of the continued hammering away at that issue being one that seems to some to reward the massacre of 1,200 people and the mutilation of thousands more. How do you look at this debate with the administration saying, for understandable reasons, that there has to be a Palestinian state, as soon as possible, and Israelis, and not just the government, saying, right now, you've got to be kidding me. Where do you come out on this discussion?
Well, let me draw from Socrates for a moment. I think it was he who said the unexamined life is not worth living. And I would update that to say the unexamined idea is not worth pursuing. Look, in theory, a two-state solution seems the obvious, logical, and only way to go forward in the context of this ongoing conflict. When I say ongoing, I don't mean since October 7th. I'm going back many, many, many decades. But simply saying that, Jeff, is not going to make it happen. Simply repeating this mantra of I'm for a two-state solution, fine, wonderful. I mean, in theory, so am I. But without asking some very practical questions. Practical question number one, you referenced it. Since 1937, since the British Peel Commission, and countless times since, there have been two-state proposals put on the table. And consistently, and this is not a talking point, I take no joy in this. My greatest yearning is for Israel to have a normal night's sleep and let its neighbors have a normal night's sleep as well. So I take no pleasure in making the point that there's been a consistent Palestinian reaction since 1937 until today to every proposal for a two-state solution. So for those Jews, who want to feel good about themselves, there's kind of a new standard in Jonathan Glazer at the Academy Awards. I'm the good Jew. I want the world to know it. I'm not them. I'm not the nasty Jew who wants to defend themselves. I'm the good Jew. And I'll even use the Holocaust, about which I just made a film, as in a way my shield. But the reality is 1937, 1947, 1948. By the way, Jeff, in a way, the most telling example for me is what happened between 1948 and 1967, 19 years, when Gaza, the West Bank, and Eastern Jerusalem were not in Israeli hands. They were in Arab hands. They could have created a Palestinian state any day of the week, and no one, certainly not Israel, could have objected. There was no Palestinian state, Jeff. There was no discussion about a Palestinian state. Why? So simply talking about it, fine. Then we talk about a demilitarized state. Then we talk about a democratic state. And the question is, are our fantasies getting way ahead of our examination of the issue of reality. And finally, there's timing. Maybe for Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign minister, maybe for some in Washington, they need to say something to kind of assuage some of their harshest critics. But now, with the Palestinian Authority, the putative partner, the Palestinian Authority having jumped on the Hamas train before it left the station, rather than trying to stop the Hamas train, with whom, Jeff? With whom? With whom to negotiate? How credibly? And by the way, I'm not even discussing internal Palestinian divisions. A two-state solution, including Gaza and the West Bank together. Mahmoud Abbas has not been able to set foot in Gaza for how many years now? 15 or more? So I come back to Socrates, the unexamined idea. It sounds good. It makes people feel virtuous about themselves. I get that. Peace, believe me, I don't know of many Israelis who enjoy cycles of war that are imposed upon them. But the Middle East is a tough place, Jeff. Someone famously said, if you're not at the table for dinner, then you're on the menu for dinner. This is Israel's reality. We might wish it were sandwiched between Sweden and Norway. It's not. And first and foremost, Israel needs to survive. And those who've underestimated the threats to its survival, I hope will have a rethinking after October 7th.
Let me ask you this, and this comes from some questioners as well. You have been extraordinarily active in very concrete ways in Mideast diplomacy among Arab countries and Gulf nations. You've been doing that for decades, and indeed, it's the case that one has gone to the Mideast and met with people in the highest levels of the governments, and they want to know what David Harris thinks because they want to know what they should think about what Congress will do and what America will do in situation X, Y, and Z. So that is background. What's your assessment of where Arab countries and Gulf countries are on this conflict and how they have handled themselves and what they actually want to have occur here?
Jeff, I'll do my best to answer the question, and then I'm going to disappear for 30 seconds because I have to get my, this is my own technical shortcoming. I have to get my charger because I don't want to lose the call. It's taking up more battery than I assumed. Look, when we talk about Middle East leaders, let's understand right from the get-go, we're talking about multiple levels of beliefs. There are public statements, there are UN votes, and then there are private thoughts. They're not all the same. This is one of the first things I learned. I first went to Saudi Arabia in 1992 or 93, very quietly. I went to Kuwait. I went to lots of places where arguably we were the first or second Jews they had ever seen there, at least as Jews. And those conversations have continued right up until the present. And the fact of the matter is that no matter what they say in public, no matter how they vote at the UN, their views tend to be much more complex. Principally, number one, most want Israel to thrash Hamas. Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was born in Egypt. It poses a threat to Egypt. It poses a threat to Saudi Arabia. It poses a threat to the UAE. I can keep going. So they want Israel to thrash it, to destroy it. They can't say it, but that's what they think in many cases. Absolutely. And number two, look how they behave, Jeff. Think back, and I'm not comparing because Israel is not Russia, but think back how we all marveled when millions of people streamed out of Ukraine temporarily and looked for refuge, and how Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Romania and the Baltic states all welcomed these people as brothers and sisters, gave them housing, gave them schools, gave them medical care, and we all applauded. And now we're watching as Egypt builds higher and higher barriers. As Israel has said, we have a temporary operation. We do not want to harm civilians. Please help us remove civilians from harm's way. Our target are Hamas terrorists, and Egypt won't let them in. Egypt is preventing them. No other Arab country I know of has offered the kind of Polish help that was extended just a couple of years ago. And we kind of take this for granted. We don't even question it. But what are those Arab countries saying? What they're saying is we don't want these people, even temporarily, to come, potentially destabilize, potentially make demands on our economy, on our medical care, on our school system. So we'll let them stay in Gaza, and we'll make Israel uncomfortable because Israel is now seen as the country that's denying civilians food and water or hurting civilians. I don't know of another army, at least in my studies, Jeff, that has gone to such lengths to avoid civilian casualties. I don't remember the United States in World War II when it said we have to destroy the Nazis, setting up a humanitarian operation in Hamburg for German civilians, much less in Japan. So again, I wouldn't take what Arab leaders say at face value. This is not the end of Israeli-Saudi discussions. This is not the end of the Abraham Accords. The ties have mostly held strongly. So I'm quite optimistic on the future. Not tomorrow, Jeff, but the day after. I'll be right back. Don't go away. Right back.
We will not. You don't get this with every webinar.
I am here.
Let me ask you another question.
I hope that was less than 60 seconds.
That was very, very impressive, but not surprising. I want to turn back to younger Americans. And I realize even you have no magic wand here, but it is urgent. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of time to try to roll back some of the insanity that exists among young Americans. There's a famous story about Adlai Stevenson in the 1952 election running against General Eisenhower. And the story goes, you'll remember it, that some woman went up to Governor Stevenson and said, Governor, I admire you so much. Every thinking person will vote for you. And he bowed and said, unfortunately, madam, I need a majority. How, given the high degree of anti-Israel fashion among young Americans and the way in which young Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, are cowed by the volume and the vitriol and the certitude, given the extent of the ignorance, and allowing for the fact that even you has no magic wand, how would you go about trying to address the problem that we have among younger Americans?
I wish I had a good answer for you, Jeff, because it's a $64,000 question, and it relates obviously to us as Jews and friends of Israel. It also relates to our future as a country. So again, I think the stakes go way wider. And this is again why I believe that we Jews should not be operating only among ourselves, but looking for like-minded friends. I have grandchildren. This is very personal. I'm watching my own married children trying to figure out where they can send their our grandchildren to school, and what schools are still not infected by a kind of woke ideology in which they, seen as white, seen as privileged, seen as wealthy, seen as powerful, the four key words that I learned early on kind of drive this woke ideology: wealth, power, privilege, and race, where they won't be seen from the get-go, either by teachers or by fellow students, indoctrinated as somehow lesser people. And we know that in some places this is now beginning in elementary school, middle school, high school, long before students get to college. So either we need new schools, new school leadership in some cases, and I think it's happening in certain places. There's a new Jewish day school that announced its opening in September as a response to this kind of woke ideology. Barry Weiss has helped create the University of Austin in Texas as a new university that is allegedly free of this. And interestingly, if I understand correctly, they've had thousands and thousands of applications, by the way, both from students and faculty wanting places at the University of Austin. We're a big country, and one new school in New York or one new university in Austin is not going to do it. So we have to tackle the existing schools. And, here, Jeff, I'll draw a page from Hegel, the German philosopher. I hope representing him correctly. But, history is not static. History keeps moving. The question is, how does it keep moving? And I think one thing we're beginning to see only in the early stages is a reaction to the reaction, meaning more and more people are waking up and saying, wait a second, when exactly did I sign on to this woke ideology, which is now going in so many different directions? It's not just that, Hamas is good, Israel is bad. It's so many more things as well, this dichotomous view of the world. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic that what we see now is what we get for years to come. I want to believe that a combination of awareness, forgive the pun, awokeness, as opposed to wokeness, awokeness, and activism on the part of parents and others will begin to push back. Look, you're up in Boston. The Harvard president, I don't believe, lost her job because of performance on December the 7th alone. She lost her job because she also was revealed to be, in a sense, uncredentialed for the job, except through woke lenses. In woke lenses, she checked the right boxes. But in terms of other lenses, academic, research, achievement, apparently she failed. So if the university will now take a second look at the presidency and appoint someone who may reflect diversity, sure, absolutely, why not? But not at the expense of the other criteria, Jeff. So again, this is way bigger than us. And of course, the irony I have to add is for how many decades and centuries, Jeff, were we seen as non-white, the Jews, poisoning white purity? Wasn't that a kind of core ideology of racist anti-Semitism beginning in the 19th century in Europe, then of Nazi ideology? How did it happen, Jeff, that we went from being non-white, of poisoning the white race, to now being seen as the ultimate whites, the quintessential whites? And here, let me bring in one other thing that has to be exposed, and that is foreign money going to American universities. This is a big one, Jeff. And I've been involved with a group called ISGAP, ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. It's chaired by the legendary Natan Sharansky. I'm now the vice chair. And several years ago, they began some really serious research on money trails. And they found that billions with a B, billions and billions have flowed to American universities from Qatar, that tiny little state in the Middle East that pretends to be the honest broker, the negotiator, the haven, when it turns out that its links to the Muslim Brotherhood, parentheses, Hamas, etc., are deep. And we find that there are at least 6 American universities in Qatar. The question is, at what price? And most recently, and again, the reaction to the reaction, Texas A&M, one of the 6, just voted 7-1 to shut down its connection with Qatar. And why is this important? Well, it turns out that Texas A&M has one of the strongest nuclear engineering programs in the country. And it turns out that the contract that was signed between Texas A&M and Qatar says that all research done in Qatar with Texas A&M is the intellectual property of Qatar. So it raises lots of questions. Again, the pushback, the reaction to the reaction, the Hegelian view of the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis, history moves on. So Jeff, rather than sort of watch this and say, there's nothing we can do, it's bigger than us, we can push back, and I think we can show some success.
David, if you'll forgive me, and you may well not, I'll just turn it back to Scott. But before doing so, let me say that the word brilliant is used by us far too much, though not as much as the British use it. But I think that we all owe you a massive debt of thanks for your brilliant leadership in the past and ongoing. Thank you so much for being with us today. And with that, let me turn it back to the Vice President of the American Society at the University of Haifa, Scott Brockman.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both David and Jeff today for today's wonderful program and really informative exchange and the questions. I'd also like to thank our listeners today for tuning in today. I want to give special thanks again to Saul Ewing, our partner of today's program. We apologize for any questions that we weren't able to get to in this webinar, but if you have any further queries and questions following this webinar, please send them to info@asuh.org. Again, for those of you who are looking to give back to the University of Haifa during this urgent time and to support our student soldiers who have been serving and defending Israel as part of our emergency scholarship fund for reserve soldiers, you can do so at asuh.org/donate. Supporters of the University of Haifa are critical partners always, and especially during this challenging time for our community and the entire state of Israel. To stay up to date on all the latest news coming out of ASUH and University of Haifa, please follow us on social. You can find our social media handles included here on the screen. Additionally, you can also sign up for our newsletters via our website, asuh.org. As mentioned earlier in today's program, this is part of a 3-part series in partnership with Saul Ewing, and future guests in the series include Ambassador Dennis Ross, former U.S. envoy to the Middle East, on March 27th, and Abraham Foxman, former national director of the Anti-Defamation League, on April 10th. Mark your calendars. Stay tuned for more information on this over the coming weeks. Thank you once again for your participation and your support. Am Israel Chai.